Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So today we have a distinguished guest, energy expert in social science area. So you are not familiar with that area, but to be interested in. So it is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Leslie Mabon. Dr. Mabon is a lecturer in sociology at Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, Scotland, United Kingdom. His research focuses on the societal and political dimension of low carbon energy, in particular governance of low carbon energy technology perceived more risky or less ethically clear-cut. Born and raised on the coast of northeast Scotland, much of Dr. Mabon's research concerns energies in offshore or coastal regions. After gaining a PhD in human geography from University of Edinburgh in 2012, he worked as a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Edinburgh, looking at public and stakeholder perception of subseabed CCS in Scotland. Since taking a faculty position at Robert Gordon University at Aberdeen in 2014, Leslie has been working on CO2 enhanced oil recovery joint industry project. And also here involved with a KICS project. Actually, Professor Shitashima or some people in this institute is involved. So today he gonna make presentation titled as "Where are we going and how are we going to get there? Understanding the socio-political context of our future energy systems." So please. Leslie, surprise us.
Okay, thanks very much. Before I start, can everyone hear me okay from the back? Excellent, so I won't bother miking up there. So, I've come from quite far away, and I'm going to start in the way I usually start, which is just to say, I'm from Scotland. We don't really speak English very well. My English is not standard, so if you have any difficulty understanding what I'm saying, if there's anything that doesn't quite make sense, please say, "Hey, slow down," or say it again. This is probably to be expected. My Japanese is also not standard. I speak with a horrendous Fukuoka accent because of my wife. But anyway. So I'm going to talk today about energy and how it relates to society. And to do that, I'm going to draw quite a lot on what is going on in my hometown at the moment. So I'm from Aberdeen. Just a quick show of hands, has anybody here been to Aberdeen? No. Excellent. That's good. It means it makes the next little bit, hopefully a little bit more interesting. Well, Aberdeen's quite a strange place, shall we say. Because we have a lot of images and graphics of oil rigs. Aberdeen is the capital of oil and gas extraction for the North Sea. And so this is in my university. We have pride of place in the hallway. We have a big model of an oil platform. We've got graphics of oil rigs. Even the pubs, the bars have graphics of oil platforms. They're at the railway station. They're at the airport. The whole of the city of Aberdeen has developed the way it has because of the extractive industries. This is right in the middle of the city, and what they're building right here, is a new shopping centre. We have a shopping centre here. We have one here. Why do we need a third? Because we have people who are earning very high salaries because of the extractive industries. We have advertisements for very expensive luxury houses. So we've got a whole city where everything is the way it is because of the energy sector. But that's not quite the full story. I was getting the taxi to the airport for coming here, and I noticed there was an advert for decommissioning. It's coming to an end. The oil industry in Aberdeen is starting to run out. It's no longer becoming so economically viable to extract oil out of the North Sea. The price of oil, you're probably all quite aware, has sunk quite a lot over the last year. And I've brought some objects with me today, and at various points I'm going to show them to you to illustrate what I'm talking about, and this is the first one. This is the newspaper on the morning when I took my flight. I don't know if you can see so well, this is the Herald, this is Scotland's main newspaper, and the headline here says, "Grim warning for North Sea jobs as oil prices fall again." So the transition away from fossil fuels as they run out towards a low carbon economy is going to have very profound effects on my city of Aberdeen. These boards traditionally would be full of jobs that anybody could pick up to go and work offshore in the oil industry. This is now blank. It's coming to an end. And the reason I tell you this sort of long story by way of introduction is to sort of illustrate that the kind of energy technologies we use and develop have a big impact on the kind of society we live in. And also, as we transition maybe away from more fossil fuel intensive technologies towards some of the carbon neutral technologies that are going to power our future, that's going to have effects on our society as well. And our society's kind of, the way it's structured and run, will feed back into how we can develop those and what we can do and what we need to do. And it's this synergy that I want to speak about today. I'm going to talk about three broad areas in doing so. I'm going to say a bit first of all about risk governance. I'm going to talk about decision making, and then lastly about building scenarios. And right the way running through all of this, I hope, will be the idea that kind of at the interface between technology and society is how we can connect these up in a realistic and meaningful way. So before I kind of get into it then, I'm just going to say a little bit about what I'm actually going to talk about. So a lot of what I'm going to do is very sort of basic and very practical in nature. I thought rather than bombarding you with some sociological theory, I thought it would be much more hopefully useful and interesting to just talk about some of the things that I've done. And so what I'm going to go into over the next 40 minutes or so are a few projects that I've been involved in, both in Scotland and overseas. So quite a lot of these are Scotland related. This is where I live, this is Aberdeen. And so I've been looking at carbon capture and storage offshore and its potential for the northeast of Scotland. And we've done some interview, discussion, group-based work with not just citizens but also experts looking at the viability of this. I've also done some work over on the west of Scotland in the same project, a small trial, which some of your colleagues from the CO2 storage division were involved in over here. And also I'm going to say a little bit about some work that's maybe a little bit closer to home for some of you, and this is some things that I've been doing a little bit more recently in Japan. So I've been looking at the potential for the CCS demonstration up in Tomakomai, looking at how members of the public and stakeholders have thought about this. And also maybe a little bit different to what you do here in I²CNER, but hopefully the underpinning ideas are relevant, is looking at how fisheries in Fukushima have been managed after the 2011 nuclear disaster, and what that says to us about how people understand risks and what kind of monitoring and remediation we might need to go alongside in our technologies. So these are just what I'm going to dip into over the course of the next 40 minutes or so. So we'll start then with this idea of risk governance. And I think it's fair to say that the kind of environmental issues we're facing at the moment are fraught with uncertainty. There's a lot of things that maybe scientists don't always necessarily agree on, things that we maybe can't be quite certain about. There's a lot of things that maybe can't always be known with certainty. And what one person thinks of as an acceptable way of taking risk might not be the same for another person. So we can get an awful lot of range of views on whether or not something is risky, whether or not it's an acceptable thing to do, whether or not it's a risk worth taking. And this is why we need these kind of processes of what I've called here risk governance. Basically just, how do we balance up all these different perspectives that are on the table? How do we balance those up in order to make the best decisions we can about deploying technology? And to demonstrate what I mean by this, I'd like to go first of all to the northeast coast of Japan and say something about fishing. Because I've spent a lot of last summer and some of this summer hanging about on the docks in Fukushima Prefecture, looking at how fisheries has been managed since the nuclear disaster in 2011. And like I said just a minute ago, whilst this is perhaps a little bit different to what's done at I²CNER with regard to the kind of technology that's involved, what I'll try and tease out from this is some of the implications for how one deals with risks when we're developing energy technologies. So as you're probably all very aware, the Fukushima nuclear accident was one of the biggest, most widely known aspects of the 2011 nuclear disaster. And since then, fisheries in Fukushima have been stopped completely because of the large amounts of radioactive contamination in the sea. It's commercially banned to catch and sell fish that have been caught off the sea off Fukushima. But what has been started more recently is trial operations, a small scale, about 10-20% of what they were doing before the disaster, very small controlled operations with the aim of seeing how much radiation is in fish and then releasing for sale species where maybe these limits are not, where we're not seeing high levels of radiation. And so this is the stage they're at now. This is something that's done very much on a trial basis. And the reason I want to talk about this is I think it says some quite interesting things about how we manage risk and uncertainty with technology and how maybe seemingly objective science can be interpreted differently and what as scientists and engineers we can learn from that. So there's a phrase that gets floated around quite a lot. In English, harmful rumours. In Japanese, fuhyohigai. And a lot of people use this when they're talking about Fukushima, talk about damage to the prefecture's reputation, to its produce, from rumours about things being contaminated with radiation. And this gets used quite a lot, especially by the sort of national level government. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of turn that on its head a bit and wonder if, well, maybe it's not baseless rumours. You know, maybe there is radiation. Maybe it's the case that different people, not just citizens, but different people with a legitimate stake, fishers, brokers, politicians too. Maybe it's just the case that people have a different idea about, you know, what is an acceptable level, what an appropriate level of contamination, and have legitimate concerns that are based on how they interpret these unknowns. So maybe it's not a case of harmful rumours. Maybe it's actually that what we're just seeing are that different people have a different understanding of uncertainty. So how do we balance that up? Well, one of the really big things they've been doing in Fukushima is trying to build trust, working at a local level, trying to connect up citizens and fishers and scientists. And an awful lot of this has been done at the very local level. So where the fishers get most of their information about whether it's safe to go fishing or not is from the local government scientists. It's not from the people at very high levels. It's not from big international studies. It's from the scientists that are employed by the local authority to check and monitor the fish. A lot of this screening gets done in situ. It's done actually, on the sides of the docks and the sides of the ports in places like Iwaki City. It's done in those places itself. But what's quite interesting about that is it doesn't get taken a long way off to a lab. It gets done on the quayside by people that before 2011 knew nothing about radiation. So it turns this whole idea of scientific expertise almost completely on its head. The people, the fishers, and to a certain extent the consumers, look to most of all for somebody to kind of give them an assessment on whether this is an appropriate risk or not, are these very kind of local level people, these very sort of local level scientists and decision makers who they screen the fish. They have these labs that they've set up right by the docks, and it makes the whole process going from catching fish through to the sampling, monitoring, the selling. This is all sort of transparent and it's done to a sort of tighter standard. The one they use is 50 becquerels per kilogram than what it is that the national government, or indeed the United Nations, recommends. So you've got this very sort of low, strict standard for radioactivity, and this idea of working at quite a face-to-face level with the local government scientists and with some of the people who've been trained to work and interact with fissures. And the thing that impressed me most of all when I first went to Fukushima was this, that these guys here, the two guys in the white in the middle, I don't know if you can see there, they are civil servants. They're employed by the prefecture, by the local authority, but they get physically involved and they sort of work together with the fishers rather than information about risk coming down from on high. They go out there, they talk to the fishers, they listen to the fishers' concerns about radiation, and they sort of work together to make decisions about how fisheries are going to proceed under these conditions of environmental risk and uncertainty. So what I would like to take out of that then is what it is that we do when we deal with very complex environmental systems and very complex environmental changes. And this is going to be the case not just for radiation, but for virtually any kind of energy technology when it comes to deploying it. We're dealing with a lot of complexity in ecosystems and in how humans interact with things. So what do we do when we maybe can't always know everything with full certainty? How is it that we can still progress towards understanding how to deploy technologies? And I've talked here about some of the value there of scientists and engineers being transparent about how they do their monitoring activities, how you can do monitoring in a way that allows people to see what's going on, and how you can acknowledge sort of limitations of what you know and what you don't know. And also thinking about maybe like local experts, where sort of points of contact are, who it is that the people on the ground are going to look to for information about risks and about uncertainty, and how people can come to make their own informed decisions on risk. So that's maybe a little bit different, and I would like to look at something a little closer to home. And this is Tomakomai, up in Hokkaido, where preparations are currently underway for the first demonstration of carbon dioxide storage in Japan. And this, I think, this is where it's going to get a bit more close to technology. Because the thing that amazed me, really, when I went to Tomakomai, when I spoke to the people involved in the project, was how seriously they were taking the business of monitoring for earthquakes. I was taken to the project rooms, the project meeting rooms in Tomakomai, and I was sat down in front of this model, which is a beautiful machine. It has flashing lights, it plays music, and it has this narration in both English and Japanese. And they made me watch this thing, which went on for a good 6 or 7 minutes because I timed it. And of all of this, it spent about 5 minutes explaining how monitoring would be undertaken to ensure that earthquakes would not be caused, or at least that they would know that there was not going to be any seismicity from carbon dioxide injection. Because understandably, when it comes to Japan and its long history of seismic activity and recent unfortunate events regarding earthquakes and energy, there's a lot of concern, it seems, around, well, how can we know that this is going to be safe? And how can we know with any kind of certainty that this is that injecting CO2 into the subsurface is not going to cause earthquakes? And so I was given this long tour. This was actually as educational for me as the formal sort of interviews I did with people. Actually getting taken around this facility was amazing because they showed me the computer rooms where they have all these machines to detect any seismic activity from CO2 injection. I was shown the various monitoring posts that they've set up where they can do real-time monitoring of CO2 injection. This is not for injecting carbon dioxide, this is just a well for monitoring. So they've drilled these big, deep wells to look at what's happening as the CO2 is injected and see if it's causing any seismic activity or not. And so what was really interesting there, it wasn't the project developers saying, this is safe, we know it's safe, trust us, we're experts. It was almost the message they were putting out was that we're very certain it's safe, we know it's safe to the best of our knowledge, this will not cause seismicity, but in case, for whatever reason, something happens, we will know right away. And so it's not saying it's safe, trust us, it's rather saying, oh, let's be transparent about this. How can we know, on what basis is this kind of knowledge made? What monitoring can we do to show that we know if any seismicity for any reason appears? How can we know that this is happening right away? And there's this big emphasis on this idea of monitoring and of taking seriously the worst case scenarios, whatever they might be. So again, what's quite interesting to come out of looking at this Tomakomai demonstration is that you've got this big emphasis on monitoring and on saying, well, we're very certain that this is not going to cause any issues, but if for any reason it does, this is how we will know right away. It's this idea of monitoring. How do we monitor? What kind of monitoring is required? And I think this seems to have worked quite well. There certainly is very little evidence of any opposition to the Tomakomai plans. They decided to drill horizontally rather than lay a pipeline, at least in part of discussions with fishers. And there's been a lot of kind of realism about what this is going to bring to the community with regard to jobs. So what we see with Tomakomai is a case where monitoring is used to sort of explain and understand how risk can be managed better. But what I want to take out of those two examples there from Tomakomai and Fukushima is that what counts as an acceptable level of risk is contingent on a range of social factors. How much we trust who's giving us information, how competent we think they are, whether we think the decision has been made fairly. So it's not necessarily always a cost-benefit analysis. All of these quite complex factors can come into it, and this can go some way to explaining why we get these different perceptions of risk that might emerge. I think it's really worth hammering home too, and this is not just a case of public acceptance. It's much more about how we deal with the range of people that are going to be involved in any decision that's being made. Understanding how influential stakeholders, the people that might have a legitimate interest in the project, how they might think of risk. Fishers, in the case of both being quite a big one in Japan. And what about policymakers? What are people who are ultimately going to give permits and licenses for some of these energy projects? How do they feel about risk? What do they want to know to see that risk management is acceptable? And also, funders and investors as well. People who might be financially backing these things. What do they think of as a risk? What do they want to see? And a kind of challenge or question I'd maybe like to think about somewhere in the future is, how can the more technical and economic assessments of risk try to maybe encapsulate or account for these less tangible social understandings that can still have very real impacts? And that's a challenge this turns into a challenge for those of you that are maybe working in more technical fields as well. How might, what kind of things do we require? There's maybe a difference between what is scientifically or technologically considered an appropriate level of monitoring versus what does society at large want to see. So what kinds of level of monitoring and remediation technologies might we require for the deployment of technology? Might it be a case that we maybe have to do more than we think is required if it means that something gets deployed? What kind of things can we know, and how can we maybe ensure that the sort of monitoring, remediation and contingency plans match up to what it is that the various sections of society want to know? And so what's socially and politically acceptable, in inverted commas, might be different to what we think of as being scientifically required. And also remembering it's not just a case of hitting citizens over the head, hitting people over the head with saying that something is safe. It can be much more about discussing complexity. A lot of people I find in my work can understand very well that there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of complexity. And if you give them the opportunity to discuss that, you can have quite high-level discussions. So that's worth bearing in mind too. What kinds of technology can be developed to address some of these concerns, and what is required? So I want to move on then to say something about making decisions. And this is where I want to bring out my second prop of the day, which is a little badge that I got given when I was in Tomakomai. And now this is very small, it's pinned to the inside of my coat, so I've put a bigger version up on the screen for those of you that maybe can't see it. So what we have here is we have the city of Tomakomai's own character, and we've got a couple of big industrial chimneys in the background. For a place like Tomakomai, which up in Hokkaido, it's a very industrial city, something like CCS, a new piece of energy infrastructure, is not something totally new to them. They're very familiar and actually very proud of having paper manufacturing in the city. So there's already this history, this story, this trajectory of having energy infrastructure that actually makes its way into popular culture. And I was so impressed with that, I made sure I took a badge with me when I left. But the thing that comes under this here, and what I want to draw out of this section, is that when we're making decisions about future society and the kind of energy that we're going to have there, we're maybe not starting from scratch. It's continuing a trajectory for a place, it's continuing a story of what has gone before. And thinking about the other things that have gone on in a location and how we can balance all of those up. So the first case study I want to use here to illustrate this is again something that is something that I²CNER has actually been involved in. This is the I²CNER experimental CO2 release, which took place in West Scotland over the last few years. I know some of the I²CNER, the CO2 storage division colleagues were involved in this. I can see Kitamura sensei sitting at the back, and I know that Shitashima sensei was over on one occasion to be involved in the trials here. Basically what they did was they injected some CO2 from the seabed into the sea to see what would happen if there was any sort of leakage of CO2 from a subsea bed storage site. And so this goes back to what I was saying a minute ago about risk governance. It's not saying this will never happen, it's saying if for whatever reason it did happen, how would we know, how would we manage it, and how would we remediate it? So this is this links this together. But my involvement in this, as you've probably gathered, was to look at some of the societal aspects of it. How does the community around this storage, around this trial site, how do the other people who work in that environment, how do they feel about a trial like this taking place? So I mean, it was quite a nice place to do a bit of field work, rather unusually for Scotland. This was one of our 10 sunny days in the year when I went to visit, and so it's a pretty nice landscape for doing field work in. However, it's also a place where energy is not the only thing that is going on. It's a working landscape where there are a lot of other land uses, tourism, fishing, recreation, and all of these other people who have a legitimate interest and stake in whether a little trial like this would be something that was worth pursuing. So this was the kind of setup that they had. They had this CO2 injection container on shore, and they drilled out into the bay and released CO2 from under the bay out into the sea. And over a 38-day period, they went to see what would happen to the marine ecosystems. So as social scientists, we came along and we observed some of the public information days that they had. We hung out with the physical scientists, looked to see who came to ask questions. We took some interviews with important people within the community, went along to the public information events that they had, and got a sense of how it was that different people reacted to the process of having this thing going on in their community. And again, thinking back to the risk governance, there was a lot in there about transparency. You know, this is what we're doing. This is the kind of monitoring we're doing. This is the equipment we're using. This is what we're using. This is how we're making our knowledge, our claim that this is a safe and reliable thing to do. And one of the main things that we found that came out of our social research around this was that it's not just risk people think about. It's not just whether something's risky, whether it's safe or not. It's a much bigger range of processes about how the deployment of a new or maybe slightly different energy technology fits into what else has gone in that place before and what's going to happen next. So when the project planners were thinking about doing this release, they had to think about, well, how does this fit with fishing in the area? How are the fishers going to feel? What might the relation be to the fishers? How might the various tourism sectors feel? How might this kind of jeopardise or otherwise the various livelihoods that people have? How does it fit with the story of everything else that is done in this place? And this was something that had to be balanced up. But the really big thing that came out of it was actually that the community were really happy with this. They were really, really supportive. We found very few people, hardly anybody in the whole area, who actually had any objection to this this trial being carried out. But one of the main reasons for that, we reckon, from what we understand, is that people doing the experiment, who are the Scottish Association for Marine Science, they're a very trusted employer. They've got a long history of doing a lot of work in the community. They provide a lot of jobs, and they set this all up as a scientific experiment. So it was a piece of science they were doing. It wasn't a piece of kind of energy deployment. The big question is what might happen when it stops being a little scientific experiment, and then it goes to being a big-scale piece of CO2 storage done by a commercial company or a private company for profit or on a bigger scale. How might this change? How might the whole decision-making process change? That's not something we would do in the west of Scotland because the geology is not suitable, but it's an issue for Scotland more widely. Because in Scotland as a whole country, we rely an awful lot on the sea. The sea matters an awful lot to us, and a lot of things go on in that sea. This is where I live. This is northeast Scotland. This is the Black Isle. And again, as you can see there, there's a lot of activity going on in the sea. It's not just an energy development, it's all the other things that go on as well. It's how do we connect up all these different dots, and how does the decision we make about energy sit within this big complex web of stuff that is going on in the sea. And this leads me to my next artefacts, which are a couple of postcards that I brought from my hometown. I bought these in the post office when I was home last September. And in both of these, what's striking is that we have oil infrastructure again appearing in oil paintings. Who would have thought it? Nice landscape paintings that you can buy. And there we've got big pieces of oil and gas infrastructure just plonked in there. So we've got a cultural context where energy is something that's really quite familiar to people, that people know a lot about, but also it has to coexist with fisheries and with the many other things that are going on in coastal regions. And so quite a lot of our work has been thinking, well, how do you balance all this up? How do you deal with this mass complexity of things that might go on around putting an energy development into an area? And indeed, the Scottish Government's recognised this. Scotland's history and culture is very important. It comes into the marine planning. So when we put energy, when we put new things into the sea, how does it fit with history and culture? How do these things get balanced up? And so quite a lot of my work recently has been going and talking to not necessarily members of the public, but people like engineers and marine biologists who know quite a lot about the environment and who maybe also have different perspectives on how to balance up decision making and thinking about whether a particular technological deployment is worthwhile in a location or not. So we talked to an environmental engineer and he said, well, why are you wanting to do CCS? It's an expensive way to continue an old-fashioned system. I think you can do better things with that. If we've got any CO2 utilisation people in the room, you'll be delighted to hear that, but that's just one perspective. We had other people that we spoke to, fishers, who said, well, there needs to be more understanding of the kind of science. We need to know more about how fish move, to know what might be affected versus what might not. Talking to environmental NGO scientists in the context of renewables rather than CCS, but still, what are the impacts going to be on marine wildlife? And so what I wanted to tease out of those examples is that managing a living environment is extremely complex, especially when it comes to energy, and we're talking over long timescales. This is not something that maybe one knowledge or one kind of set of knowledge can address completely. It might even be the case that you have people with similar disciplines and disciplinary backgrounds who maybe don't always have the same view. And so how can we think about making decision-making processes that can balance all these up? How can we address all of this complexity? And this is something that social scientists love, because if we had answers to this, we'd all be out of a job. So I'm not saying it's in our interest to sustain this, but these are very complex processes and want us to think about how do we balance and make decisions. But having said that, it's also true that policymakers and investors, they need options that require certainty. They need to know that things might work with a certain degree of certainty. If you're wanting to fund something, if you're going to give permission for something to happen, you need a certain degree of certainty. How might we think of ways to gather all these different knowledges, all this complexity? How might that be presented in the most effective ways to people that need to have this information? Or how can we make sure that all these different knowledges, all these different understandings can be balanced up? And that's something that I'm wanting to think more about from now on. It's some work we've started to do, but it's something that needs to be thought about a lot more. And the big question, I think, which is really important under all of that is, it's great to think about what's nice and socially acceptable and what's desirable and etc., and having these nice organic decision-making processes, but how do we balance up this with the engineering and scientific realities of energy and climate? How do we balance up this idea of making good, fair, just decision-making processes with maybe some of the realities that are out there? And this is what I want to come on to last, is scenarios. And that's how can we better connect up these social factors with the underpinning science and technology, and how can they sort of work alongside each other? So I talk a lot about Scotland here, and I'm going to do so some more. I've got my last artefact, which is this. This is a little stress reliever. It's a stress reliever in the shape of a wind turbine. Because wind is something that we are very excited about in Scotland. We're very proud of our wind energy, both onshore and offshore infrastructure. And it's something that the government, developers are really keen to sort of push. It's become a real source of national pride, Scotland's wind potential. And again, I don't know if any of you know this, but there's actually a very interesting story about offshore wind in Scotland and a certain potential American presidential candidate, which I'd be happy to talk about over coffee afterwards if anyone's interested, but it's become quite an issue. So, it's something that there's a lot of pride and a lot of excitement about. And when one talks to maybe less technically informed stakeholders or citizens about things like carbon capture and storage, what often comes back to us is, why don't we just do wind? Wind's much better. Why don't we just invest everything in wind? And whilst that's fantastic, I mean, I'm really proud of Scotland's renewable potential too. But one of the challenges is, well, how do we deploy that? How can we get to maybe where we want to be, and how do we square up with some of the realities? And this is a lot of work that I've been involved in quite recently, is, well, there's certain things that less technically engaged stakeholders might want, there's things that the public might want and politicians might want, but how are we actually going to get there? And so this wonderful story that the Scottish Government has about wind and renewables, how does that maybe square with some of the more technical estimates of where we're going to go and what's going to make up the rest of our energy mix? And so some work that myself and my former colleague Simon Shackley have done is we'll going to a lot of people and saying, okay, that's great. We want to aim for this carbon neutral society. How do we get there if we accept things like that we need deep and rapid cuts in anthropogenic emissions, but we have issues like industrialising countries using fossil fuels. We have the fact that some of these technologies are maybe quite expensive and it's going to be maybe consumers or taxpayers that have to pay for them. How do we balance all these things up? How might things like carbon capture and storage help us to get to that destination? Might people be prepared to accept some of the less ethically clear-cut, maybe some of the things that people don't know so much about? Might they be prepared to accept some of those technologies to understand how to get to this zero carbon destination? And what we found was actually yes. Once you have discussions with people about what some of the engineering and technological realities are of the various options, find that you can get quite a lot of pragmatism about using things like CO2 storage. Again, not just from people who gain financially from it, but also from people who think we need to reduce emissions urgently, and people who admit that decarbonisation has to happen quickly, but that it's not necessarily always, how do we fit that with what is the energy infrastructure that we have. So this is some work that we started looking at to think about, well, once we try and merge some of the scientific technological engineering realities with what citizens want, how might we try and bridge any gap that might be there between what society wants and what is technologically viable. And this has led into a piece of work that I've actually just finished, and when I say just finished, I mean just finished as in the paper got submitted while I was waiting to board my flight coming here, and this is work on CO2 enhanced oil recovery in the North Sea. Again, this is perhaps a little different to some of the things that get done at I²CNER, but what I'd hope to tease out is what it shows about linking up the societal aspects with some of the more technical economic aspects of scenarios. So, if we go right back to the start of the lecture, we've got a problem in Aberdeen. We have a lot of people who need jobs. We've got an energy sector that needs renewed. How do we try and link this up? So I've been involved in a project with Scottish Carbon Capture and Storage, thinking about CO2 enhanced oil recovery with carbon dioxide capture and storage as a means to connect these things up. So we capture CO2 from power stations, industrial sources, we inject it into subsurface geology, and we bring some oil back out. The idea there being that you're decarbonising the power and industry sectors, but at the same time bringing some oil back out. And so what myself and my colleague Chris Littlecott did was we took a few scenarios that some economists had made for how this could be done. The idea behind all of it, I should say, just to be clear, is that it provides some of the finances and funding for making CO2 storage happen. It gives you some of the know-how and the monitoring data in theory, so that when it comes to doing storage without bringing more fossil fuel back out, you have better technical knowledge. That's the theory, at least. But what we did was we looked at some different scenarios that some economists had made for different levels of intensity you could do this at, how much CO2 you injected, how much oil you recovered. And we distilled that down into 4 scenarios that we then presented to groups of not just citizens, but also engineering experts, marine scientists, people who might be able to give us different perspectives on the viability. And we had different ones depending on how high your ambition for mitigating climate change was versus how high your ambition for bringing more oil and gas out. Whether going from doing nothing at all to doing a lot of CO2 injection and a lot of recovery towards focusing on renewables, or maybe only bringing back what was economically viable. And what we found, first of all, was that virtually everybody we spoke to became less enthusiastic. We asked everyone, first of all, what they thought would happen, or what they wanted to happen, sorry. So there was a lot of enthusiasm for mitigating climate change, for doing a lot of storage. Everybody, when you said, okay, realistically, what do you think the government's actually going to do? Everybody came down this way. Everybody came towards saying, we don't think anything's going to happen, or we don't think that we're going to get as much happening as we hoped for. And very sadly, if any of you follow the news around UK energy policy, they were all right, because the UK government, sadly last week, withdrew all of its funding for any kind of carbon capture and storage. They withdrew the funding they'd had for the big demonstration, so this was a little bit prescient, unfortunately. But of more interest here was looking at, well, what are the barriers and the enablers to getting these technical projects to happen? And what was quite interesting for us was that the people that we spoke to that knew the most about doing this, so the finance kind of experts that we talked to, the economists, the people who were involved in the offshore industry, they were the ones who were most sceptical. They were the ones who had the most technical knowledge, and they were the people who were coming back to us and saying, yeah, but your scenarios say this, but actually in reality, what we find is slightly different. And so a lot of the big barriers that came out of this were, well, why would you actually bother doing CO2 enhanced oil recovery when it's only going to bring a small amount extra oil back? And how do you get past this problem of having politicians who think on 5-year cycles versus the sort of long-term planning we need? But then we also saw some of the enablers, some of the kind of positives, some of the things that could make this happen was, especially with the sort of more policy-orientated people saying, okay, let's think of CO2 EOR as a managed transition away from fossil fuels and a way of enabling some of these more renewable technologies, whether we do things like we set up a trust fund and we say a certain percentage of that then goes into renewable technologies. Maybe we can set up a national CO2 storage company. We saw some of these ideas, these suggestions were coming back to us that we then can feed back to the technical people, to the more economic, policy, engineering focused people and say, look, this is what not just citizens, but this is what the various experts we've spoken to have said. Can we then feed these back in and make stronger scenarios? And we got some quite nice little quotations as well when we talk to people. And I mean, this I think sadly is my favourite one of all. This was an energy analysis from some analysis company in Aberdeen, and he says to us, if it did make economic sense, the oil companies would already be doing it, which was a little bit depressing, but useful to have that kind of analysis. And we had people who said to us, well, these scenarios that your geologists have come up with are great, but in reality, I know that the oil platforms we have are not going to be suitable for this, so you need to think about this again. So they said, the platforms are too old in the North Sea. You'll need to think about how to do this differently to make it work with the platforms that we have. Somebody from finance saying, look, from a finance perspective, there needs to be more specificity. So what's kind of a bit different there is that we used some of the social science research techniques that we have, and rather than applying them to working with citizens or members of the public, we applied them to people who actually know quite a lot. And from that, we were able to get some good, nuanced feedback on these technical scenarios. And so, particularly the limitations to the models, how technically suitable the infrastructure in the North Sea is, what kind of policy regimes might need to be put in place in order for this to be viable, and how you might make this happen. People told us things that we hadn't thought of ourselves. Making a fund for renewables, setting up a national storage company, these kind of things. And so the next step then is going to be saying, well, now that we have this information, let's put this back in to some of the work that the more technical parts of the programme are doing, and let's see if we can use this more social science-driven data to give us some ideas about how we might make techno-economic scenarios that will connect better with what might happen in society. So especially with both of these, what I've tried to do is kind of get past the idea that I often hear, certainly back in the UK, which is that social science research is all about finding out what the public thinks. And what I've tried to illustrate here is that there might be ways we can actually use this to help us integrate and think about more robust technical and economic scenarios. So how might we take some of the ideas that we have, how might we talk to people about them, what kind of feedback might we get from them, especially when it comes to speaking with expertise from finance, engineering, economics, and policy. Where might some of the limitations be? Where might we get some input on what is viable, realistic, and where might there be suggestions for improvement? And trialling these as well with stakeholders and citizens can maybe give us a sense of how we might deploy these in practice. What might be considered appropriate for society, what might remove some of the barriers in terms of opposition, what kind of things might people want to see for this development to happen. So I'm nearly at time. That's really all I wanted to say. I just wanted to wrap up by kind of reflecting a little bit on what I've talked about. Now, Scotland is a long way away. I've said that before. But I'm not the first person to come to Kyushu from the northeast of Scotland. Over 100 years ago, Thomas Blake Glover came with lots of technologies and things from near Aberdeen, from near where I'm from, and landed in Nagasaki and deployed various things and made lots of connections with Japan. So his context where he came from was from the northeast of Scotland, and he brought ideas and knowledge with him to Japan and learned from what was going on here as well. This is his house, which is in the city of Aberdeen. This is a slightly more familiar picture. Fukuoka and Aberdeen are maybe a little bit different in terms of the context. Climate is a big one. It's nice and warm here. It was really cold when I got on the plane to come here. Sport is another one. Our sports team plays in red and sucks. Your sports team plays in yellow and are excellent. The Hawks are very, very strong, I know. Technologically as well, we rely very much on oil and gas. Whereas I come here to Kyushu and I see all sorts of great things being trialled around campus, hydrogen and wind turbines and all sorts of things going on. So there's some differences, but what I think is maybe quite useful from the Scottish examples that I've shown you is we've got a society in the north of Scotland in Aberdeen where we're seeing a transition happen, very much integrated with the society. We have a society that has been built on a previous energy system, and it's a really nice little treat as a little test case for how the transition to new energy systems is causing all sorts of issues and opportunities and challenges for the society it's deployed into. And hopefully that's something I'd like to think about, whether that might be the case in a place like Fukuoka as well. So this is hopefully what I've tried to show is that this is more than just public perception or acceptance. Rather, it's tools and approaches for understanding what kind of society the carbon neutral technologies of today and tomorrow are going to be deployed into, how we can create the conditions for these being deployed, what it is, maybe where some of our R&D efforts need to be focused, and how this can be linked up. And how in maybe quite complex situations, quite scientifically, technologically, and socially complex situations, how we can balance up the range of knowledges and expertises that we maybe need to make decisions that connect up the technology with society. And I'd like to just finish with a kind of big question. This is a kind of question that I try to make sure always underpins my research, and I'd be actually really interested to know any thoughts that you have on it. And that's, how do we bring this social context into the R&D process? How do we bring it into the science, into the engineering, into the technology? How do we, realise all these issues about what kind of society we want to live in, while still keeping in mind some of the scientific and engineering realities that are out there? How do we balance up the kind of society we want to live in with the sort of more technical aspects of what's going to get us there, how we're going to get us there, and what is required to help us to reach that destination? So I think I'm at time, so I will finish there. I'll thank you all very much for listening to me last thing so close to the end of semester, and I'd like to invite any questions you might have.